In the vast plains of northern India lies a small village called Gangapur, hidden amidst dense forests and criss-crossed fields. The villagers live off farming and livestock, rising with the sun and retiring at dusk. Their days pass in simplicity and monotony. When the sun sets, casting an orange glow over the entire village, it feels serene and peaceful. Rasha was born in this village. Now, 20 years old, she has dark skin and bright, determined eyes. Despite her family's modest means, she always strives to stay neat and tidy. Unlike other girls in the village, Rasha has always been different. She loves listening to stories of the outside world, often borrowing old books from her teacher and reading them under the starlit sky. The villagers describe her as a bit unusual, a comment that is both a compliment and a warning. Every evening, Rasha enjoys sitting alone by the lakeside at the edge of the village, gazing at the shimmering water, lost in thought. While she dreams of exploring the world beyond, she feels deeply tethered to her land. She knows her family and the village traditions would never allow her to venture too far. Yet a nagging sense of unease lingers in her heart. Beneath this tranquil surface, something indescribable seems to be stirring. Rasha's parents were ordinary farmers in the village of Ganjapur. Her father, Manji, was a carpenter whose skill couldn't quite make up for the lack of demand, leaving the family perpetually struggling. Her mother, Savita, was the backbone of the household, toiling in the fields from dawn till dusk while managing domestic chores. Despite their hardships, they did their best to provide for Rasha and her younger brother. They firmly believed that a girl's ultimate destiny was marriage, and education was an unaffordable luxury meant only to teach basic literacy. In the summer of her 20th year, her parents suddenly announced that they had arranged a marriage for her. Her groom was the eldest son of Mohan, a wealthy landowner in the village, 10 years her senior, and a man she had never met. Mohan worked in the city and rarely returned home. Rasha tried to resist, but her mother's tears and her father's weary sighs crushed her protests. "This is for your own good. You won't go hungry in his house," they told her. The words pierced her heart like a thorn. The wedding was hastily organized. While the grand feast made the entire village envious, Rasha felt like a commodity being traded. Mohan's indifferent gaze and his apparent disinterest in the ceremony deepened her sense of despair. After the wedding, she moved into Mohan's house, a much larger and more comfortable brick home compared to her family's hut. But its cold walls only heightened her loneliness. Mohan didn't show hostility toward Rasha, but also didn't display any affection. He spent most of his time in the city and barely spoke to her during his brief visits home. Meanwhile, his family elders wasted no time pressuring her to produce an heir for the family. Their words hammered at her spirit, making her feel trapped in a marriage devoid of love, freedom, and fulfillment, replaced instead by relentless expectations. A year had passed since the wedding, but there was still no sign of pregnancy from Lasha. At first, Mohan's family kept quiet. But as time went on, the atmosphere grew heavier. Mohan's mother, Kamala, began dropping hints like, "A good wife knows how to bring joy to the family." Though her words seemed casual, they cut into Lasha's heart like a knife. Mohan remained silent, frowning during these conversations, but never standing up for Lasha. Faced with increasing pressure, Lasha felt like she was walking on thin ice. The villagers began looking at her strangely, as if her body harbored an unspeakable flaw. Kamala even secretly consulted a herbal healer who prescribed various fertility tonics. Lasha was forced to drink them daily, their bitter taste matching the sleepless nights filled with her growing anxiety. Finally, Kamala made a decision: to seek help from Harisa, the village's most revered astrologer. This old man was seen as a messenger of the gods, claiming to peer into the secrets of fate through prayers and stargazing. Despite his steep fees, villagers flocked to him for solutions, whether for failing crops or troubled marriages. It seemed he always had an answer. Harisa was invited to Mohan's home. Lasha sat nearby, nervously wringing her hands. Harisa's appearance unsettled her. His hair was snow-white, his eyes piercing and brooding, and every word he spoke felt like a verdict. Kamala knelt before him, pouring out her family's woes and pleading for a way to secure their future. A few days later, Harissa conducted a destiny-changing ritual. He lit incense and chanted mysterious prayers, the atmosphere solemn and stifling. Lasha, forced to participate, knelt on the floor amidst the clanging of bells and murmurs of mantras, her mind blank with dread. At the end of the ritual, Harissa delivered a shocking conclusion. The problem does not lie with Lasha, but with Mohan. The pronouncement stunned everyone present. Kamala froze in disbelief, while Mohan's father, Ajay, furrowed his brows. Lasha's heart swirled with a mix of relief and fear, freed from blame, yet terrified of what this meant for her. However, what Harissa said next left everyone reeling. "The family's bloodline must be preserved," he declared. "According to divine insight, there is a solution." Turning his gaze to Ajay, he continued in a low voice, "For the sake of the family's future, Mohan's father must conceive a child with Lasha. Only this will ensure the purity of your lineage." The room fell into a stunned silence. Lasha froze, her hands trembling, consumed by anger and fear. Mohan's family seemed paralyzed, as if weighing the gravity of Harissa's proposal. For Lasha, it felt as if she had been pushed into an abyss. The ritual was merely the beginning of her ordeal, as an even darker nightmare loomed ahead. The night was heavy, suffocating the air with its weight. Rasha sat alone in the corner of her room, hugging her knees tightly as silent tears streamed down her face. Harissa's absurd proposal left her feeling furious and humiliated, but even more unbearable was her family's reaction. Kamala had stopped her taunts, but now spoke with an air of inevitability, urging Rasha to cooperate for the greater good. Mohan remained silent, like a soulless puppet. The most chilling was Ajay, who showed no remorse or struggle, but instead accepted the task with eerie composure. Rasha tried to resist, turning to Mohan and pleading for his support. "Go for a medical checkup. Modern medicine can find the problem and fix it. It's better than this superstition," she begged. But Mohan shook his head coldly, muttering, "Don't bring this up again. The family won't allow it." He didn't even look at her before walking away, extinguishing her last glimmer of hope. Rasha felt isolated and powerless, her will to resist gradually worn down by the family's indifference. One evening after dinner, Kamala suddenly became unusually kind. She handed Rasha a steaming bowl of soup, speaking gently. "Drink this. You need to be strong for our new beginning." Suspicious, Rasha shot her a wary glance, but Kamala's persistent urging left her little choice. Reluctantly, Rasha drank the soup. Soon, dizziness overwhelmed her, and her mind grew foggy. She tried to steady herself, but eventually collapsed to the floor as her consciousness began to fade. In the haze, she vaguely heard murmured voices and approaching footsteps before darkness swallowed her whole. When Rasha awoke, it was already the next morning. Her body felt weak, her clothes were disheveled, and the room was cloaked in a suffocating silence. Straining to recall the events of the previous night, a chilling realization crept over her. Suddenly, the door opened, and Kamala entered with a tray of breakfast, her face lit up with rare cheer. "It's all over now," she said lightly. "From today, take care of yourself." Her tone was casual, as if discussing the weather. Rasha froze. She understood Kamala's words and realized what had happened the night before. Pain ripped through her heart like a jagged knife. Anger and shame surged like a tidal wave, but there was no outlet for her anguish. What made it worse was the family's celebratory attitude toward the atrocity. Ajay showed no guilt. Instead, he calmly sipped tea while chatting with other family members. Mohan sat silently, his head bowed, saying nothing. That day, Rasha moved through her tasks like a lifeless puppet. Her eyes were devoid of light, but within her, a fire was quietly igniting. Anger, humiliation, and defiance intertwined, and she realized she could endure no more. The cruelty of her family and their violation of her body had shattered her world, planting the seeds of revenge deep within her heart. That night, Rasha sat in her dark room, her hands clenched into fists so tightly that her nails dug into her palms, yet she felt no pain. She looked out of the window, her gaze cold and resolute. This time she didn't cry because she knew tears wouldn't change anything. The fury in her heart was growing into a storm that would bring destruction. The village was silent in the dead of night, with only the soft rustling of leaves carried by the breeze. Lasha sat in the corner of her room, her eyes bloodshot, clutching a cup tightly in her trembling hands. Memories of her family's cold indifference and the humiliation of the previous night replayed in her mind. The rage in her chest felt like a volcano ready to erupt, each breath slicing through her heart like a blade. She had tried to resist, but her efforts had only been met with more oppression and neglect from her family. Isolation and despair wrapped around her like a venomous snake, pushing her to the brink of collapse. As dawn approached, Lasha's fingers trembled slightly, but her gaze was clearer and colder than ever. Slowly she stood up, opened the door, and walked resolutely toward the small iron cabinet in the house, where the family kept their hunting rifles. The key was usually kept in AJ's room, but she had long noted the spare key hidden behind the kitchen cabinet. She opened the cabinet, running her fingers over the cold metal until she grasped a heavy hunting rifle. At that moment, a strange calmness washed over her, as if the fear and struggle within her had been stilled by the weight of the weapon. She returned to the living room and silently made her way to Ajay's bedroom. Lasha pushed the door open. Ajay was still asleep, his breathing slow and steady. She raised the rifle, aiming at his chest, her eyes devoid of hesitation. As she pulled the trigger, the gunshot exploded like thunder, shattering the village's quiet and heralding the family's doom. The gunshot jolted the entire family awake. Kamala was the first to rush out of her room, and when she saw Ajay lying in a pool of blood, she let out a piercing scream. Mohan collapsed to the floor, trembling and paralyzed with shock. Lasha stood in the center of the room, expressionless, though the rifle in her hands quivered slightly. "You're insane! Do you even know what you've done?" Kamala screamed, her voice filled with anguish. Lasha didn't respond. Her gaze swept across the room, landing on each family member before she abruptly turned toward the kitchen, grabbing a sharp knife from the counter. Her steps were steady and deliberate, the blade gleaming coldly under the dim light. "Enough! Enough of this!" Lasha's voice was low but seething with fury, her eyes burning with intensity. She lunged toward Kamala, who let out a terrified shriek and tried to back away, but couldn't escape the slash of the knife. Blood spurted from a deep gash on Kamala's shoulder, staining her clothes crimson. The family scattered in panic, scrambling to find something to stop Lasha. For the first time, Mohan snapped out of his shock and rushed to try and wrest the weapon from her hands. But Lasha's rage gave her strength he hadn't anticipated. She shoved him aside with all her might and turned back to continue her rampage. Amid the chaos, neighbors, alarmed by the gunshot and screams, called the police. Within minutes, officers arrived and subdued Lasha, who was still struggling amidst the chaos. Her hands and feet were cuffed, the knife slipping from her grip and clattering onto the floor. As she was escorted into the police car, she murmured to herself, "They deserved it. Every one of them deserved it." The village night returned to silence, but the air was thick with the scent of blood and fear. Lasha's rage and anguish had finally unleashed the darkness hidden within her family, rewriting her fate with that single gunshot. The interrogation room in the police station was brightly lit but cold and sterile. Lasha sat handcuffed to a chair, her arms limp at her sides. Dried blood remained on her face, but her eyes were vacant. Across from her, the officer hesitated, his pen poised above his notebook. His gaze was complicated, a mixture of confusion and disbelief. After a long silence, Lasha finally spoke, her voice hoarse and low. "I've had enough." With that first sentence, memories of pain and oppression poured out like a broken dam. She recounted everything she had endured since marrying into Mohan's family, the coldness of her in-laws, the relentless pressure to conceive, being forced to accept Harisa's absurd ritual, and, most horrifying of all, that night when Ajay violated her. Hearing this, the officers exchanged glances, their shock apparent. Even in this village known for its traditions and closed-mindedness, they had never imagined anyone would devise such a horrifying solution to ensure lineage continuity. What chilled them even more was the entire family's tacit approval and support. "So, you shot him?" the officer asked. Laxia nodded, her tone icy and resolute. "Yes, they ruined my life. I had no other choice." The case was quickly forwarded to the local court for a preliminary trial. Given its sensitive nature, touching on domestic violence, murder, and entrenched cultural practices, the case caused a sensation in the village and surrounding areas. During the trial, the court deemed Lasha's actions to be premeditated murder and sentenced her to life imprisonment. However, the verdict only intensified public debate rather than quelling it. Some people believed Lasha's actions were a betrayal of tradition, condemning her for disrupting family harmony. Others felt anger and sorrow for her plight, viewing her as a victim of a deeply oppressive society. Outside the courthouse, supporters and detractors clashed, their arguments filling the air. As the case gained momentum, the media and social platforms began to take notice. Numerous women's rights organizations stepped in, striving to secure a more just verdict for Lasha. These groups pointed out that Lasha was not only a victim of domestic abuse, but also of systemic gender inequality. Her extreme act of defiance was, in their eyes, a desperate cry against oppression. In a televised interview, a prominent lawyer calmly stated, "If Lasha had any other choice, would she have resorted to killing? What we need is not just to judge her, but to examine why our society left her with no options." The case quickly turned into a national issue. It exposed the tension between law and societal norms, sparking heated debates on women's rights and feudal traditions. Lasha's story became a mirror, reflecting the injustices hidden beneath the surface of customary practices. It also thrust her into the spotlight as she faced a turning point in her fight to reclaim her destiny. A few months later, the retrial took place in a major city far from the village. Unlike the closed and constrained atmosphere of the initial trial, this time, the courtroom was filled with journalists, social activists, and groups advocating for women's rights. In the courtroom, Lasha sat in the defendant's seat. Her gaze remained steady, but compared to the initial anger and despair, there seemed to be a newfound sense of calm within her. In court, Lasha's defense attorney presented new evidence, revealing the long-term domestic violence and sexual assault she had endured. Through a series of professional assessments and witness testimonies, the court finally acknowledged that the suffering and harm inflicted on Lasha were not sudden or impulsive. Her resistance was not merely an act of defiance, but a desperate attempt to survive in an unbearable situation. As the trial unfolded, even the prosecutor began to recognize that while Lasha's actions were extreme, her life circumstances and psychological state offered crucial context. Ultimately, the court decided to reduce her sentence. Lasha's original life imprisonment was commuted to 12 years in prison. When the verdict was announced, a low murmur spread across the courtroom. Some in the gallery sighed deeply, while others showed a hint of relief. All eyes were on Lasha. She remained silent but unwavering, with her deep eyes seeming to shine with a long-lost glimmer of hope. At the end of the trial, Lasha was asked to give a final statement. She stood up, her voice clear, but laden with pain. "I only wanted to protect myself." A simple sentence, yet it struck like lightning, breaking the silence of the courtroom. It carried profound sorrow and repression. In that moment, everyone could feel her despair and hear her desperate cry for survival in the face of overwhelming darkness. In that fleeting moment, Lasha's suffering and resistance reached their zenith, and her words became the most poignant symbol of the case. She was not a villain. She was a woman pushed to her limits, yearning to claim a small measure of justice and freedom for herself. Lasha's case ultimately became a focal point of social discussion, transcending a single family's tragedy to reflect profound issues surrounding women's rights, superstitious traditions, and judicial justice. To many, Lasha was not just a victim. Her story symbolized countless women silenced under the constraints of traditional norms. The oppression and suffering she endured mirrored the lives of numerous women in closed societies. This case revealed deep-seated societal problems. Beneath the entrenched superstitions and traditions, Women's status remained low, their choices disregarded, and even their bodies and souls subjected to exploitation. Lasha's resistance, though filled with anger and despair, also illuminated a societal pathology. When the law fails to protect, and oppression by tradition and family becomes an institutionalized injustice, her violent retaliation served as a voiceless cry, exposing society's neglect and exploitation of women. Lasha's story provokes reflection. In such societal structures, how can we fight for the freedom and dignity of every woman? How can we dismantle the invisible chains that bind them, granting them the right to make their own choices and live with dignity? This is not merely a question of her personal fate, but a call to challenge the broader societal framework. Countless women lose their voices and strength in the struggle against tradition, and such suppression ultimately leads to tragedy. But Lasha's case does not signify an end. It continues to spark widespread discussions in society, driving reforms and introspection on issues like women's rights, domestic violence, and judicial fairness. This story is far from over. It is not just about Lasha's pain, but a source of inspiration and a call to action for every listener. Everyone who hears this story cannot help but ask, how can we change an unfair society? How can we amplify the voices of those fighting silently? And how can we secure more freedom and respect for all women?